Okay.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7.
Mom, I can hold it.
Okay. Eric Liddell. Chapter 7 is A Troubled Land. Eric settled into his seat for the trip to London as the train rattled along. He began catching up on his reading. You're kind of a bad camera person, sorry. He began catching up on his reading. He especially wanted to reread some of the letters his father had written him about what to expect when he got to Tientsin. The letters were not light-hearted, but told of the huge problems facing China in 1925. Eric's father told about the waves of fighting and revolution that had swept over the country in the 18 years since Eric had left China. As a 5-year-old, in 1911, I didn't do the punctuation right that way. I have to read it again. Eric's father told about the waves of fighting and revolution that had swept over the country in the 18 years since Eric had left China as a 5-year-old. In 1911, the Qing dynasty, which had ruled China for 267 years, collapsed. Following its collapse, a new Republic of China was declared and a new government was set up. But the new government was racked with divisions and turmoil. So, like many others in Chinese history, when there wasn't a strong government in control, local warlords, using their private armies, began to exert their control over certain areas. For several years now, these local warlords and other political factions had been locked in a bitter struggle for control of China. Eric's father had written that there were basically 3 groups involved in the struggle. There was the local warlords, the nationalists, or the Kuomintang, as they called themselves, and a new group, the communists, who patterned themselves after the Bolsheviks, who had seized power in Russia and transformed that country into the Soviet Union. The Kuomintang was the largest and most powerful group and found most of its support in the cities. It was also recognized as the rightful government of China, though it by no means controlled the country. The communists were a small but growing group, and most of their support came from the rural areas in the south of China. As these different factions fought for control in various regions, it was not uncommon for some villages to change hands between a warlord. The communists and the nationalists, 5 or 6 times a year, each time an army passed through a village, the village's occupants had their homes robbed and their food supplies stolen. When an army marched through the countryside, it would steal the crops from the field and trample those not ready to harvest so that the other groups couldn't get their hands on them. This, in turn, had led to famine. Apart from the fighting itself, China's other enemy was foreign influence. The people of China had been humiliated by the British during the First Opium War of 1839 to 42. China had many goods that Great Britain wanted to trade for, but the Chinese wanted nothing except silver from the British in return for them. When the British tried to force opium on the Chinese instead of silver, when the British tried to force opium on the Chinese instead of silver as payment for the goods they wanted, the emperor had refused. He ordered all opium destroyed. This, in turn, angered the British, who began a war with China. The British easily won, and China was forced to sign a treaty to end the war. Not only did the treaty allow the British to import opium into China, but it also opened up a number of coastal cities where foreigners could live and trade. The treaty left the Chinese people feeling weak, powerless, and very angry. I'd be angry too. What were the Brits thinking? Once China had been weakened, its neighbor Japan saw a great opportunity to expand. In the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 95, China had lost control of Taiwan completely, as well as most of its influence over the Korean Peninsula. In 1914, 3 years after the collapse of the Qing dynasty, World War I began in Europe. China eventually sided with the Allies, Great Britain, France, and Russia, against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In joining with the Allies, China had hoped to be taken seriously as a nation and gain some respect as a country when the war was over. However, things did not work out that way. At the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended World War I, the Allies completely ignored China's demand that, in return for fighting in the war, foreign powers should pull out of the country and leave China to govern herself. The people of China were furious at this result. They felt they had been betrayed by the Allies. This in turn led to even more bitterness towards foreigners than had existed before the war. To the Chinese, foreigners, along with their ways of doing things, were symbols of China's humiliation. It was to this China that Eric Liddell, now 23, would be returning. His father's letters made it clear to Eric that unlike when he was a small boy with lots of Chinese friends, he would not be welcome in many Chinese homes, and sometimes his life might even be in danger. Despite the warning, Eric was determined to go. He felt that God had called him to work in China, and he was prepared for whatever might happen to him while he was there. When Eric had left China as a child, the only way to get to and from England was by ship. Now, in 1925, the Trans-Siberian Railway rolled across western Russia, over the Ural Mountains, and across Siberia, finally ending in Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. In eastern Siberia, a line branched off from the Trans-Siberian Railway and headed south into China. It was possible to board a train in The Hague, Holland, and go overland all the way across Europe and Asia to Tientsin, China. That was the route Eric chose. From London, he took a boat to Holland, where he caught the train. 2 weeks later, the train was rolling along in China. Eric did not go all the way to Tientsin right away. However, the railway passed through the seaside town of Paitaiho, where Eric's entire family was waiting for him. They were all on vacation there together and thought it would be a good idea for Eric to join them for 6 weeks before traveling on to Tientsin to prepare for the new school year. It was late afternoon when the train finally pulled to the stop at the station in Paitaiho. Eric clambered onto the platform and into the welcoming arms of his family. He was thrilled to be seeing his parents, Jenny, Ernest, and Robert, again, and he was especially glad to meet Robert's new wife. The family stayed up very late that night, swapping stories with Eric about what had happened to them since they had last seen each other. They were especially anxious for Eric to tell them all about what it was like to run and win a gold medal in the Olympic Games. There was one matter, though, that James Liddell decided to leave until the next morning to discuss. Over several cups of hot tea the following morning, he broke the news to his son that there were no students to teach the following year at the Anglo-Chinese College. All 500 of them had gone on strike. It all began in Shanghai when a group of Chinese workers at the Japanese-owned cotton mill had been fired. All of the other Chinese workers at the mill had gone on strike in support of their fired co-workers. Students in Shanghai had decided to hold a demonstration to support the workers, but their demonstration had turned into a nightmare. British colonial forces, who protected the British Quarter of Shanghai, or British Concession as it was known, fired on the Chinese students and striking workers. One demonstrator was killed in the shooting. The event became known as the May 30th Massacre, and news of it spread quickly throughout China. Students and workers went on strike all along the eastern coast of China, and Tientsin, with its large foreign population, was a natural target for such a strike. The Anglo-Chinese College was one of the first places in Tientsin to empty out. Students there were made to feel ashamed at going to a school where 5 of the 30 teachers were from England and where the English language was taught. Soon they stopped showing up for class, and the school had closed early for 1 year. Over the next few days, Eric met most of the other English teachers from his new school. The teachers were all vacationing in Paitaiho. Most mission organizations seem to have vacation cottages there. At picnics and other games of tennis, the teachers discussed the situation among themselves. Eventually, they decided to open the school as usual in September and wait to see whether any other Chinese students came back to enroll for the new year. Eric, who had forgotten nearly all the Chinese he'd spoken so well as a small child, set about studying the language while in Paitaiho. Soon he found himself remembering more and more Chinese words and phrases. Surprisingly, Eric also knew most of the missionaries vacationing in Puerto. Many of them had stayed in London and visited their sons at Eltham College. Others had visited Eric in Edinburgh when they were home on furlough. In fact, there was only one family there he had not seen before, the Mackenzies from Canada, who had 2 daughters, Florence and Margaret. Ooh, is he going to fall in love with one of them? After 6 wonderful... Oh, wait, what time is it? 1 second. What time is it?